On a rainy afternoon in the bustling streets of New Orleans, a frail old man and his wide-eyed grandson caught the sharp stares of a growing crowd. Their crime? Simply helping a lost little girl. But in a world quick to judge by appearances, their kindness was met with suspicion. "Who are you? And why is she with you?" A stern voice broke through the murmurs. The crowd tightened around them, whispers turning to accusations. "She doesn't look safe. Call the police." Walter Green, a humble shoeshiner with calloused hands and a quiet strength, held his ground. Beside him, 12-year-old Eli clutched his battered harmonica, his young face torn between fear and resolve. The little girl, Charlotte, clung to Walter's arm, her teary eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to listen. "She's with us because she was lost," Walter said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise like a lighthouse in a storm. "We're taking her to safety." But the murmurs didn't stop. The weight of prejudice hung heavy in the air. People whispered about their appearance, their station in life. Then, a police officer arrived. The crowd waited, breaths held, for him to deliver judgment. Would he see the truth or fall prey to the same bias that surrounded them? As tension reached its peak, a tiny voice broke the silence. Charlotte stepped forward, her small frame trembling, but her words unshakable. "They saved me. They're not bad people. They're the only ones who helped me when I needed it most." In that moment, the line between kindness and suspicion blurred. The question lingered. Would humanity prevail over prejudice? Or would the world turn its back on those who dared to do good? The morning sun poured over the cobblestone streets of a quaint New Orleans neighborhood, casting golden reflections on the small shops and bustling market stalls. The aroma of fresh beignets wafted through the air, mingling with the chatter of vendors and the occasional honk of a passing car. Among the lively scene, an old man sat on a wooden stool near the corner, his hands skillfully buffing a pair of worn leather shoes. This was Walter Green's domain, a quiet corner where he earned a humble living shining shoes. At 70, Walter had weathered the storms of life with a calm resilience etched into every line of his face. Beside him sat his grandson, Eli, a spirited 12-year-old with a harmonica clutched tightly in his small hands. The boy played a cheery tune, its lively melody weaving through the morning air, drawing occasional smiles from passers-by. "Keep playing, Eli," Walter encouraged, his voice warm but firm. "Music can brighten even the darkest day. People need that." Eli nodded, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "You think someone might give us a tip just because they like my music?" he teased. Walter chuckled. "Maybe, or maybe they'll stop to listen and leave feeling a little lighter. That's worth more than a tip." Eli paused his playing, looking thoughtfully at his grandfather. "Grandpa," he began, "did you always work like this? Shining shoes?" Walter's hands slowed as he turned to look at his grandson. "No, Eli. When I was your age, I dreamed of building things. Houses, furniture, things people could use and be proud of. I became a carpenter, and for a time, I thought I'd found my calling." "What happened?" Eli asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Walter sighed, his gaze distant. "A fire. One night, it swept through my shop and destroyed everything I'd worked for. Every plank of wood, every tool, gone." Eli's face fell. "Didn't anyone help you rebuild?" Walter shook his head gently. "People have their own struggles, Eli. Sometimes all you have to start over is your own two hands. So, I did what I could. I found a new way to make a living." The boy's harmonica lay silent in his lap as he absorbed his grandfather's words. "But weren't you mad? It doesn't seem fair." "Oh, I was angry," Walter admitted. "But anger doesn't rebuild what's been lost. It only eats away at what's left. I chose to focus on what I could do, what I could give back." As Walter buffed another pair of shoes, Eli's lively tune resumed, drawing the attention of a middle-aged man in a tailored suit. His polished leather shoes clicked loudly against the cobblestones as he approached, his gaze sweeping over the humble setup. "Well," the man said with a faint smirk, "this takes me back. It's good to see someone keeping old-fashioned trades alive, though I imagine there isn't much money in it." Walter looked up, his expression calm. "It's an honest living," he replied simply. The man handed over his shoes, inspecting the boy with faint amusement. "And the kid? Teaching him the family business? Something like that, Walter replied as he began polishing the shoes. He's learning more than just this trade. Eli bristled, sensing the man's condescension. His fingers itched to respond with a sharp note on his harmonica, but a subtle glance from Walter stopped him. The man continued, oblivious to the tension. Well, best of luck to you both. Seems like luck's about all you've got. When the man walked away, his shoes gleaming, Eli blurted out, "Why'd you let him talk to you like that? He had no right." Walter set his tools down and met Eli's fiery gaze. "Eli," he said gently, "that man's words say more about him than they do about us. Remember, our worth doesn't come from what others say. It comes from how we live." As the morning wore on, a warm voice called out from across the street. "Walter, Eli." It was Mrs. Clara Robinson, a kindly neighbor who often stopped by with small gifts or words of encouragement. Today she carried a basket with 2 steaming beignets wrapped in a cloth. "I thought you two could use a little treat," she said, handing one to each of them. "Still making this corner brighter, I see." "Thank you, Mrs. Clara," Walter said, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. "You're too kind." Eli bit into his beignet, powdered sugar dusting his nose. "Mrs. Clara, you're the best," he said with his mouth full, earning a chuckle from both adults. As they talked, Mrs. Clara's expression softened. "This corner reminds me of my boy," she said wistfully. "He used to love music too, played the guitar, even wrote his own songs. I always thought he'd make it big. But..." She trailed off, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Walter nodded solemnly. "He'd be proud of you, Clara. You've kept his memory alive by spreading kindness." Eli looked up, his voice earnest. "I'll play a song for him one day, Mrs. Clara, I promise." Clara smiled, her eyes misty. "You're a good boy, Eli. Keep that promise." As the sun climbed higher, Walter and Eli continued their work. Customers came and went, some with hurried steps, others lingering to chat. Eli's harmonica filled the gaps between words, its notes a simple but heartfelt gift to the street. Walter watched his grandson play, pride warming his chest. Life hadn't been easy, but moments like these reminded him of what mattered most. Together, they were building something no fire could destroy: resilience, hope, and a connection to those around them. "Eli," he said softly, "remember this. The world may not always be kind, but that's exactly why we must be." And with that, the morning unfolded like any other. Ordinary to those passing by, but extraordinary in its quiet acts of love and perseverance. The early afternoon air carried a subtle warmth as the streets of New Orleans buzzed with activity. Vendors called out their wares, children darted between stalls, and the occasional bark of a stray dog blended into the lively symphony of the neighborhood. Walter had just finished polishing a customer's shoes, handing them back with a polite nod. "Thank you, sir. Take care now," he said with his usual calm tone. Eli, sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, played a light-hearted tune on his harmonica. The melody danced through the air, drawing occasional smiles from passers-by. "Eli," Walter said, packing away his tools. "Time to call it a day. Looks like the rain's coming." Eli glanced at the sky. Dark clouds loomed overhead, creeping closer by the second. "We'd better hurry," he muttered, jumping to his feet and grabbing their small wooden box. The first raindrop splashed onto the cobblestones, followed by another, and within moments, the heavens opened. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the bustling street into a chaotic scramble. People ducked into shops and under awnings, shielding themselves with newspapers and bags. Walter and Eli quickly sought shelter beneath the narrow overhang of a closed cafe. As Walter shook the rain from his hat, Eli squinted through the downpour. His eyes landed on a small figure huddled under the awning of an abandoned storefront across the street. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the rain soaking through her pink raincoat. She looked small, too small to be alone. "Grandpa," Eli said, tugging at Walter's sleeve, "look over there, it's a little girl." Walter turned, following Eli's gaze. His brow furrowed as he took in the sight of the girl. She stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could will the world to disappear. "We can't leave her there," Walter said firmly, stepping into the rain without hesitation. Eli, clutching his harmonica, hurried after him. The rain soaked through their clothes as they crossed the street. Walter approached slowly, his voice gentle. "Hello there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her wide eyes darting to Walter and Eli. She took a small step back, pressing herself against the wall. "Don't be scared," Walter said, stopping a few feet away. "My name's Walter, and this is my grandson, Eli. We just want to help." Eli crouched down, smiling as he pulled his harmonica to his lips. He played a soft, calming tune, the notes rising and falling like a lullaby. The rain seemed to fade into the background as the music wrapped around them, gentle and inviting. The girl's breathing slowed, and after a moment she whispered, I can't find my mom." Walter's heart tightened. He crouched down to her level, his expression kind. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Charlotte," she said, her voice barely audible. "Well, Charlotte," Walter said with a reassuring smile, "you're not alone anymore. We'll help you find your mom. Does that sound all right?" Charlotte hesitated, her small hands clenching into fists at her sides. Then, slowly, she nodded. Walter extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Charlotte placed her cold, trembling hand in his. "Do you remember where you last saw her?" Walter asked gently. Charlotte sniffed, her voice shaking. "We were at the market. I saw something shiny, and I stopped to look. When I turned around, she was gone." "That's all right," Walter said. "We'll start by getting you somewhere safe. Let's head to the police station. They'll help us find her." As they began walking, Eli played another melody, this one bright and cheerful. Charlotte glanced at him, a faint smile flickering across her face. "Do you always play that thing?" she asked softly. Eli grinned. "Only when I need to make someone smile." "Did it work?" Charlotte giggled lightly, nodding. "A little." Walter watched the exchange with a quiet smile. Eli's harmonica had always been more than just an instrument. It was a bridge, a way for him to connect with the world, even on its grayest days. As they continued down the street, their steps splashing in shallow puddles, they passed a man sitting beneath the awning of a closed bookstore. He strummed a guitar, the melancholy tune weaving its way through the rain-soaked air. The man's hat was old and worn, his coat patched in several places, but the music he played was steady and soulful. Walter nodded toward the man as they walked. "That's Mr. Samuels," he said, his voice low. "He used to be a teacher. Now, he plays music to get by." Charlotte tilted her head, her curiosity momentarily distracting her from her own worries. "Why doesn't he teach anymore?" Walter sighed, his tone tinged with reflection. "Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but Mr. Samuels found another way to share what he loves." Charlotte watched the man for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he's happy?" Walter smiled gently. "Happiness doesn't always look the same for everyone. For him, maybe happiness is in the music he shares." Eli, ever the joker, chimed in. "I bet I could outplay him on my harmonica." Walter shot him a look, a mix of amusement and gentle reproach. "Not everything has to be a competition, Eli." Eli shrugged, his grin wide. "Maybe not, but it's more fun when it is." Charlotte giggled again, the sound light and unexpected. It felt like a small victory, her laughter cutting through the lingering tension of the storm. Ahead, the police station came into view, its modest brick facade glowing faintly under the streetlights. Walter slowed his pace, glancing down at Charlotte. "We're almost there," he said gently. "Inside, the officers will help us find your mom. You don't need to be scared. They just want to make sure you're okay." Charlotte hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. What if they don't believe me?" Walter crouched again, his tone steady. "They'll believe you, Charlotte. Just tell them the truth, and everything will be all right." Eli leaned in with his trademark grin. "And if they ask who saved you, you can tell them it was me. Thanks to my harmonica, of course." Walter shook his head with a chuckle. "Always the performer," he muttered, his affection for the boy evident. As they climbed the steps to the station, the rain began to taper off. The clouds overhead started to part, allowing a single beam of golden light to break through. It shone down onto the wet street, reflecting off the puddles like scattered pieces of sunlight. Walter paused at the top of the steps, looking at the two children beside him, Charlotte, still holding tightly to his hand, and Eli, brimming with playful confidence. He took a deep breath, his heart steady. "All right," he said. "Let's bring you home, Charlotte." With that, they stepped through the station doors, leaving the storm behind them. The soft patter of the rain had nearly ceased as Walter, Eli, and Charlotte began their final stretch toward the police station. The puddles on the cobblestones reflected faint golden light from the street lamps, their dim glow lending the deserted streets an almost ethereal quality. Walter's steady pace led the way, his posture calm and reassuring, while Charlotte kept close at his side, her small hand still clutching his. Eli trailed slightly behind, his harmonica poking out of his pocket, ready for any moment that might call for a tune. "It's so quiet," Charlotte murmured, her voice barely rising above the soft squelch of their footsteps. "That's the rain's doing," Walter said. "It has a way of washing everything else away, leaving behind the kind of quiet that makes you notice things you might have missed before." Eli glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in the details. The usual vendors and street performers were absent, their places marked only by overturned crates and closed-up carts. Even the familiar hum of the city had faded, replaced by the occasional drip of water falling from rooftops. "It's kind of spooky," Eli said, shivering slightly. Walter chuckled softly. "Spooky? It's just peaceful, Eli. Not everything quiet has to be scary." Charlotte looked up at him. "But it's still strange," she said. "I've never seen the streets like this." "That's what makes it special," Walter replied, his voice warm. "Moments like this remind us that even busy places can rest, just like people." The trio passed by a small cafe, its windows fogged up from the lingering humidity. Inside, a few patrons sipped coffee, their laughter muffled but comforting. Walter gestured toward the scene. "See that?" he said. "No matter what's happening outside, people always find a way to keep going, just like we're doing now." Charlotte glanced into the cafe, her gaze lingering on a young boy about her age sitting at a table with his mother. Her expression softened, a flicker of hope passing through her tired eyes. "Do you think my mom's looking for me right now?" she asked quietly. Walter stopped, turning to face her. "I don't think, Charlotte. I know she is. A mother's love doesn't let anything get in the way. She'll be as determined to find you as you are to get back to her." Charlotte nodded slowly, her grip on Walter's hand tightening. "I hope she knows I didn't mean to get lost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She does," Walter assured her. "Mothers always know." Eli, sensing the heaviness of the moment, pulled out his harmonica and began to play a light, playful tune. The bright notes bounced off the empty buildings, bringing a spark of life back to the quiet street. Charlotte glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Do you ever stop playing that thing?" she teased, her tone lighter now. "Only when I'm sleeping," Eli shot back, grinning. Walter chuckled. "And even then, he probably dreams about it." "I bet I do," Eli said proudly. He walked a little closer to Charlotte, his voice dropping to a mock conspiratorial whisper. "You know, if this were a movie, this would be the part where I play a heroic song and save the day." Charlotte giggled, the sound warm and bright. "Well, I think you already did," she said, surprising herself with the words. Eli blinked at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. Then he grinned, his chest puffing out. "See, Grandpa? Told you I'm a hero." Walter shook his head, smiling. "You're something, all right." As they turned a corner, the faint outline of the police station came into view. Its brick facade was modest but solid, illuminated by a single overhead light. The sight of it brought a wave of relief over the group, though it also carried an air of uncertainty for Charlotte. "We're almost there," Walter said, sensing her hesitation. "This is where the real work begins. But don't worry, you're not alone in this." Charlotte looked up at him, her lips pressing into a determined line. "I'm ready," she said, her voice small but steady. Eli gave her a thumbs up. "And if they ask who the hero is, I'll be right there to set the record straight." Charlotte rolled her eyes but smiled, her nervousness easing slightly. Just as they reached the station steps, the front door opened and a tall police officer stepped out. His uniform was damp from the rain, and his expression was one of calm authority. He noticed the trio immediately, his gaze softening as he took in the sight of the young girl holding Walter's hand. "Good evening," the officer said, his voice firm but kind. "Can I help you folks?" Walter stepped forward, his tone measured. "This young lady got separated from her mother at the market. We're here to make sure she gets home safely." The officer nodded, gesturing for them to come inside. You're in the right place. Let's get her settled and see what we can do to find her family." Charlotte hesitated for a moment, glancing up at Walter. He gave her an encouraging smile, gently squeezing her hand. "You've been brave so far, Charlotte," he said. "This is just one more step. You can do this." Taking a deep breath, Charlotte nodded and walked inside, her small hand still in Walter's. Eli followed close behind, his harmonica clinking softly against his pocket. As the door closed behind them, the quiet of the streets was left behind, replaced by the steady hum of activity within the station. For the first time since the rain began, Charlotte felt a glimmer of hope, like a light breaking through the clouds after a long storm. The warmth of the police station's glow barely reached the cold, rain-soaked streets as Walter, Eli, and Charlotte made their way closer. The trio moved with quiet determination, each step feeling like progress, though the unease in Charlotte's posture lingered. As they turned onto the final stretch leading to the station, a voice broke through the quiet. "Hey, what's going on there?" Walter turned slightly, his hand instinctively tightening around Charlotte's. A young woman stood on the sidewalk across the street, her umbrella tilted just enough to shield her from the drizzle. Her sharp eyes darted between Walter and Eli before settling on Charlotte. Her expression quickly shifted from curiosity to suspicion. "She looks scared," the woman said, her voice growing louder as she stepped closer. "Are you all right, little girl?" Charlotte froze, instinctively pressing closer to Walter's side. Eli glanced at his grandfather, unsure whether to step in or stay quiet. Before Walter could respond, a second voice joined in, this time a middle-aged man in a raincoat emerging from a nearby shop. "Yeah, what's going on here? That girl doesn't look like she's with them willingly." Walter's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm as he spoke. "She's lost. We're taking her to the police station to find her family." But the explanation didn't seem to ease the growing tension. A few others began to gather, murmurs of doubt spreading among the small crowd. "You expect us to believe that?" the woman said, her tone sharp. "A man like you? No offense, but this doesn't look right." Charlotte clutched Walter's hand tighter, her voice small but insistent. "They're helping me. They're not bad people." Her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as the murmurs grew louder. "They look suspicious," someone muttered. "Why didn't they just call the police instead of bringing her here themselves?" another added. Eli couldn't hold back any longer. "We're trying to help her," he said, his voice high with frustration. "Why don't you mind your own business?" "Eli," Walter said softly, his tone firm but calm. "Let me handle this." Walter turned to the crowd, his steady gaze moving from one face to the next. "I understand your concern," he said evenly. "But this little girl needs help, and we're doing what anyone should, making sure she gets it." The murmurs didn't completely die down, but some of the crowd seemed to hesitate, uncertain now. Still, a few remained defiant. "That's what they all say," the man in the raincoat sneered. "How do we know you're not lying?" The sharp sound of a harmonica cut through the tense air. Eli played a quick, assertive tune, his young face set with determination. The suddenness of it caught everyone off guard, momentarily breaking the tension. "Listen to her," Eli said, lowering the harmonica. "She's been scared all day, and we're the only ones who helped her. Does that sound like something bad people would do?" Charlotte took a deep breath, her small voice rising above the murmurs. "They're telling the truth. They found me when I was lost. Please, stop saying bad things about them." The crowd faltered. Some exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence in their suspicions beginning to waver. Before anyone could respond, the flash of red and blue lights illuminated the street. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and an officer stepped out. He was tall, his uniform neat despite the dampness of the night. His name tag read J. Carter, and his expression was one of calm authority. "What's going on here?" Officer Carter asked, his voice firm but measured. His gaze swept over the crowd before landing on Walter, Eli, and Charlotte. The woman with the umbrella stepped forward. "Officer, I think something's not right here. That girl looks scared, and these two, well, they don't look like they should be with her." Walter remained composed as Officer Carter turned his attention to him. "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" Walter nodded. "This young lady got separated from her mother at the market. We found her and are bringing her here to get help finding her family." Officer Carter crouched slightly, his expression softening as he addressed Charlotte directly. "Is that true, sweetheart? Are you okay?" Charlotte hesitated, glancing at Walter before nodding firmly. Yes, they've been helping me. I was lost, and they found me. They're not bad people. The officer studied her for a moment, then straightened, his gaze returning to the crowd. All right, folks, that's enough, he said. Let's not jump to conclusions here. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, their murmurs fading as they moved away. Walter let out a quiet breath of relief, though his posture remained steady. Officer Carter gestured toward the station. Let's get inside and sort this out properly. Walter nodded, leading Charlotte and Eli up the steps. As they entered the station, the tension from the encounter slowly began to ease, replaced by the quiet hum of the building's interior. Charlotte glanced up at Walter, her voice soft. Why were they so mean? Walter paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people let fear guide them instead of kindness, he said. But that doesn't mean we should stop doing what's right. Eli chimed in, his tone still tinged with frustration. They didn't even listen. It's not fair. No, Walter agreed, his voice calm. But life isn't always fair, Eli. That's why it's so important to stand tall, even when it feels like the world's against you. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Do you always do the right thing, even when people don't believe you? Walter smiled faintly. I try, Charlotte, because at the end of the day, it's not about what others think. It's about knowing in your heart that you did the right thing. As the door to the station closed behind them, the rain finally stopped, leaving the streets outside quiet once more. Inside, the warmth of the station enveloped them, a stark contrast to the cold suspicion they had faced just moments earlier. For the first time all evening, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that everything might just turn out all right. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was calmer, yet there was an underlying tension in the air. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the worn-out desks and stacks of paperwork scattered across the room. Walter, Eli, and Charlotte sat on a bench along the wall, waiting for Officer Carter to finish speaking with his colleagues. Charlotte's small legs dangled above the floor, her hands clutching the edges of the bench nervously. Eli shifted beside her, his fingers fidgeting with his harmonica. His usual playful demeanor had dimmed, replaced with frustration from their earlier encounter. Walter sat on the other side, his posture calm but alert, as if ready to shield the children from any lingering suspicion. Grandpa, Eli whispered, leaning closer, why do people always assume the worst about us? We were just helping. Walter looked at his grandson, his eyes steady and kind. Because fear often speaks louder than reason, he said softly. And sometimes, people don't take the time to listen to the truth. Eli frowned, his young face shadowed with doubt. It's not fair. No, it's not, Walter agreed. But fairness isn't something the world gives freely. It's something we have to fight for by staying true to ourselves. Officer Carter approached, his expression a mix of professionalism and quiet empathy. He crouched slightly to address Charlotte directly, keeping his tone gentle. Charlotte, we've put out a message to locate your mom. It shouldn't take long to hear back. Do you feel safe here with these two? He glanced briefly at Walter and Eli, his question clear, but without malice. Charlotte nodded quickly, her grip tightening on Walter's sleeve. They helped me, she said firmly. I was scared, and they made me feel safe. Carter studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod before standing. All right. While we wait, I'll need to ask a few questions to make sure everything's in order. He gestured toward a small conference room, indicating Walter and Charlotte should follow. Eli, you can wait here, Carter added. Eli opened his mouth to protest, but caught Walter's subtle shake of the head. With a huff, he slumped back on the bench, his harmonica resting in his lap. In the conference room, Officer Carter placed a recorder on the table and clicked it on. For the record, he began, his voice calm. Can you state your name? Walter Green, Walter replied evenly. Carter nodded. And the boy outside is your grandson? Yes, his name is Eli. And how did you come across this young lady? Carter asked, his tone remaining neutral. Walter recounted the events of the day with measured clarity, his voice steady. He described finding Charlotte in the rain, her fear, and their decision to bring her to the station. Carter listened closely, occasionally jotting down notes. When Walter finished, Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You seem like a good man, Mr. Green, but you must understand why some people might be suspicious in a situation like this. Walter met his gaze without flinching. "I understand," he said calmly, "but I didn't stop to think about how it might look. I only thought about what was right." Carter held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "And that's why you're here now," he said simply, "because doing the right thing matters." Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Eli sat fuming, his fingers absently tapping the harmonica against his knee. When another officer walked by, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Why does everyone think we're the bad guys?" he blurted out, his frustration spilling over. The officer stopped, looking at Eli with raised eyebrows. "What do you mean?" the officer asked, his tone cautious. Eli gestured toward the room where Walter and Charlotte were being questioned. "We helped her, that's all. But out there," he pointed toward the door they'd come through earlier, "nobody believed us. They just saw us and thought the worst." The officer hesitated, then crouched down to Eli's level. "Kid, sometimes people let their fears get the best of them. It's not right, but it happens. What matters is that you know the truth, and so does she." He nodded toward Charlotte, who was visible through the small window of the conference room. Eli looked down at his harmonica, his frustration giving way to a quieter determination. "I just want people to see us for who we are, not who they think we are." The officer gave him a small smile. "That's a good way to think, kid. And trust me, actions speak louder than words. You and your grandpa already did the right thing. That's what counts." Back in the conference room, Charlotte's voice broke through the tension. "Officer Carter?" she asked softly. Carter turned to her, his expression softening. "Yes, Charlotte." "Walter and Eli are good people," she said, her small hands clutching the edge of her chair. "I don't know why everyone outside was so mean, but they didn't do anything wrong. They saved me." Carter gave her a reassuring nod. "I believe you, Charlotte, and you're very brave for saying that." Walter glanced at Charlotte, his heart warming at her courage. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, sweetheart." Carter stood, clicking off the recorder. "That's all I need for now," he said. "You three can wait in the lobby while we finalize everything." As they stepped back into the waiting area, Eli immediately sprang to his feet. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes darting between Walter and Charlotte. "We're fine," Walter said with a small smile. "Now we wait." Eli let out a breath of relief, plopping back onto the bench beside Charlotte. He pulled out his harmonica, playing a soft, soothing tune. The music seemed to settle the room, its gentle notes carrying a sense of calm that contrasted with the earlier tension. Charlotte leaned against Walter's side, her eyes half closed as the day's exhaustion began to catch up with her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Walter looked down at her, his expression full of quiet pride. "You're welcome, Charlotte." As the harmonica's melody filled the space, the rain outside finally stopped, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt like a promise of better things to come. The soft hum of activity in the police station continued as Walter, Eli, and Charlotte waited. The lobby, though warm and dry, carried an air of unease for Charlotte, who clung tightly to Walter's arm. Eli sat cross-legged beside them, his harmonica resting on his lap. The boy occasionally glanced at the door, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of what might happen next. Charlotte's small voice broke the silence. "What if she's not coming?" Walter bent down slightly, his tone steady and comforting. "She's coming, Charlotte. A mother always finds her way to her child." The little girl nodded, though her grip on Walter's sleeve remained firm. Eli reached out, nudging her shoulder lightly. "Hey," he said, offering her a small grin. "You've got the best team in your corner. Me, my harmonica, and Grandpa. We're unstoppable." Charlotte giggled softly, the sound breaking through her nervousness like a crack of sunlight through storm clouds. The moment was interrupted by the sharp sound of the front door swinging open. All three heads turned as a man and a woman stepped into the station, their expressions tense and searching. "Charlotte!" the woman cried, her voice trembling with relief. Charlotte's head snapped up, and in an instant, she was on her feet, running toward them. "Mom! Dad!" The woman, Margaret Benson, dropped to her knees, catching Charlotte in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she held her daughter close. Beside her, David Benson, Charlotte's father, stood stiffly, his gaze shifting between his daughter and the two strangers who had been sitting with her. Walter rose slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged as he watched the reunion. Eli remained seated, though his curious eyes darted toward David, who was clearly sizing them up. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, pulling back just enough to examine her daughter. "Are you hurt?" Charlotte shook her head vigorously. "I'm okay, Mom. They helped me." She pointed toward Walter and Eli. "They found me when I was lost and brought me here." Margaret's gaze followed her daughter's gesture, landing on Walter. Her expression softened almost immediately, her gratitude evident. David, however, took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "Why were you with them?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "David," Margaret said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "No," David continued, his eyes narrowing at Walter. "I want to know what happened. Why didn't you call the police as soon as you found her?" Walter held his ground, his voice calm and even. "Because she was scared," he explained. "She needed someone to help her feel safe, and the best way to do that was to bring her here myself." David's gaze didn't waver. "You expect me to believe that?" Charlotte tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, stop. They're nice. They helped me when no one else did." David hesitated, his daughter's words cutting through his suspicion. Margaret stepped closer to Walter, her tone gentle. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "For staying with her, for bringing her here." Walter inclined his head slightly. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. Just doing what anyone should." Eli couldn't hold back any longer. "It wasn't just anyone, though," he piped up. "It was us, and Grandpa even made sure she didn't get too scared while I played the harmonica to keep her calm." David's eyes flicked toward Eli, his stern expression faltering slightly at the boy's earnestness. "Your harmonica, huh?" he asked, a hint of skepticism creeping into his voice. Eli nodded enthusiastically. "Yup, music's good for the soul. At least, that's what Grandpa says." "And it worked, didn't it, Charlotte?" Charlotte giggled, nodding. "It did." Margaret smiled, her eyes misty as she looked at Eli. "You must be very brave to help someone like that." "Brave?" Eli said, puffing out his chest. "I'm the bravest. Grandpa's just old." Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Careful, Eli, or you'll be shining shoes for a week straight." Margaret laughed softly, her tension easing further. Even David seemed to relax slightly, though his guarded posture didn't completely disappear. Officer Carter returned, clipboard in hand. "Good news," he said. "We've confirmed the Benson's information and everything checks out. Charlotte can go home with her family now." Charlotte beamed, clutching her mother's hand tightly. Margaret smiled through her tears, her relief palpable. But before they could leave, Charlotte turned back to Walter and Eli. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For everything." Walter crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. "You're welcome, Charlotte. Remember, even when things seem scary, there's always someone who'll help. You just have to let them." Eli stepped forward, offering her a fist bump. "And if you ever need more music, you know where to find me." Charlotte giggled, returning the gesture. As the Bensons prepared to leave, David lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he extended a hand toward Walter. "I may have been quick to judge," he admitted gruffly. "Thank you for looking out for my daughter." Walter shook his hand firmly. "It's what anyone should do. Take care of her." David nodded, his grip lingering for a moment before he turned to join his wife and daughter. Margaret gave Walter one last grateful smile. "You've given us more than you know. Thank you." As the door closed behind the Benson family, the station grew quiet once more. Eli turned to Walter, his voice low. "You think her dad's always that grumpy?" Walter chuckled. "He's just a man who loves his family, Eli. Sometimes that makes people act tough." Eli thought about this for a moment, then nodded. "I guess. But I like Charlotte. She's cool." Walter smiled, patting Eli's shoulder. "She is, and so are you, kid." The Benson family car idled in front of their home, the quiet hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the stillness. Inside, Charlotte leaned against Margaret's arm, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion after the emotional events of the day. David sat stiffly in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as his thoughts churned. Margaret glanced at him, her tone gentle but probing. "David, what's going on in your head? You've been silent ever since we left the station." David exhaled deeply, his grip loosening but not releasing. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't stop thinking about him." "About them." "Walter and Eli?" Margaret asked. "Yes," he said quietly. The way he carried himself, the way he answered my questions. There was something about him. David hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror at Charlotte, who had drifted into a light doze. I didn't want to trust him, but now I feel like a fool for doubting him. Margaret leaned back in her seat, her eyes steady on her husband. You were scared, David. It's natural to be protective, but you let fear guide you instead of reason. David winced at her words. He knew they were true. I judged him, Margaret. I saw a man who didn't look like us, didn't live like us, and I assumed the worst. Charlotte didn't hesitate to trust him, but He trailed off, unable to finish. Margaret's voice softened. You can't change what happened, but you can change how you think moving forward. It's not too late. Later that night, after tucking Charlotte into bed, David sat alone in the living room. The soft glow of the table lamp illuminated his face as he stared at his phone. His search history from earlier was still open. Articles about economic struggles in the city's poorer neighborhoods, statistics on inequality, and personal stories of those who worked hard despite the odds. He thought about Walter's hands, calloused, strong, yet careful as they polished shoes. He thought about Eli's music, how the boy had used his harmonica to comfort Charlotte in ways that words couldn't. Most of all, he thought about the dignity Walter had shown in the face of David's suspicion. Margaret entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down beside him and sat across from him, her gaze thoughtful. Still thinking about them? She asked softly. David nodded, taking a sip of the tea. I can't shake it, Margaret. They were nothing like I expected. I judged them, but they didn't judge me back. Walter just stood there, calm, patient, even when I all but accused him of something terrible. That says more about him than it does about you, Margaret replied gently. He chose kindness when he could have been angry. That's a lesson worth learning. David ran a hand through his hair, his voice low. I don't want Charlotte to grow up thinking it's okay to see people the way I did today. I need to fix this, not just for her, but for myself. The next morning, David found himself driving back toward the neighborhood near the police station. The streets grew narrower as he approached the corner, where Walter and Eli had been earlier. He parked a short distance away and stepped out, his eyes scanning the street until he spotted them. Walter was seated on his stool, meticulously polishing a pair of worn boots. Beside him, Eli played a jaunty tune on his harmonica, the lively notes drawing smiles from passers-by. Despite the simplicity of the scene, there was a quiet strength in the way they carried themselves, a dignity that stirred something deep within David. He hesitated, his feet rooted to the pavement. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave, to avoid the discomfort of confronting his own mistakes. But then Eli spotted him, and the boy's face lit up. Hey, it's Charlotte's dad, Eli called out, waving enthusiastically. Walter looked up, his calm eyes meeting David's. There was no animosity in his gaze, only quiet curiosity. David took a deep breath and walked toward them. As David approached, Eli jumped up from his seat, his harmonica clutched in one hand. Where's Charlotte? He asked eagerly. She didn't come with you? She's at home, David replied, his voice steady but hesitant. I needed to come here alone. Walter straightened in his seat, his hands resting on his lap. What brings you back? He asked evenly. David shifted uncomfortably, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. I wanted to thank you, properly, for helping Charlotte, and... He paused, his voice faltering. To apologize for how I acted. I shouldn't have doubted you. Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded. It's not the first time someone's judged me unfairly, he said, his tone matter of fact. And it won't be the last, but I appreciate you saying that. David nodded, his chest tightening. I've always been cautious, especially when it comes to my family, but I let that caution turn into something else, something that blinded me to the truth. You didn't deserve that. Walter's expression softened, his voice thoughtful. We all have our biases, David. The important thing is recognizing them and choosing to do better. Eli, ever the bold one, chimed in. Grandpa's always right, and he's smarter than he looks. Don't let the old man thing fool you. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. Don't listen to him. He's just buttering me up because he thinks I'll buy him ice cream later. David smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Charlotte said you were good people. She was right. Before leaving, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I run a community organization," he explained. "We focus on improving neighborhoods like this, education, job opportunities, that sort of thing. If there's anything you need, or if Eli's interested in music programs, give me a call." Walter took the card, his fingers brushing over the raised print. "Thank you," he said simply. David hesitated, then extended his hand. Walter shook it firmly, their gazes meeting with a sense of mutual respect. As David turned to leave, Eli called out after him, "Tell Charlotte I said hi, and don't forget, music makes everything better." David laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "I'll tell her. Take care, Eli." The drive home was quieter, but David's mind was anything but. He thought about Walter's words, about the way the man had carried himself with quiet strength and unwavering kindness. It wasn't just Walter who had changed the course of that day. It was David's own willingness to confront his prejudice and learn from his mistakes. As he pulled into his driveway, David felt a sense of clarity. He had come to understand that trust wasn't something that could be demanded or assumed. It had to be earned, and sometimes it took courage to give it. Margaret met him at the door, her expression curious. "How did it go?" she asked. David smiled faintly, stepping inside. "It went well," he said, "better than I expected." And for the first time in a long while, he felt as though he was moving forward, toward a better version of himself. The following weekend, the Benson family decided to visit a small local park near their home. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm golden light over the city, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Charlotte skipped ahead, her spirits noticeably lighter, as she hummed a tune Eli had played on his harmonica. Margaret followed closely, carrying a small picnic basket, while David walked a few steps behind, lost in thought. "David," Margaret said, slowing her pace to match his. "You've been quiet all morning. What's on your mind?" David shook his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Just thinking," he said. "About everything, about them." "You mean Walter and Eli?" Margaret asked knowingly. David nodded. "I can't stop replaying the whole thing. The way they handled themselves, the way they cared for Charlotte like she was one of their own. It's been humbling." Margaret smiled softly. "They taught us something, didn't they?" David chuckled under his breath. "They taught me for sure. I never realized how much I needed to unlearn." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her voice warm but firm. "You're doing it, David, and Charlotte's noticing. That's the best gift you can give her, showing her how to grow and change." Charlotte's voice interrupted their conversation. "Mom, Dad, over here," she called, pointing toward a familiar figure sitting on a nearby bench. It was Walter, his hands resting on his knees as he observed the quiet activity of the park. Eli was beside him, playing a soft tune on his harmonica, his foot tapping along to the rhythm. The melody was simple but cheerful, blending seamlessly with the peaceful atmosphere. "Can I go say hi?" Charlotte asked eagerly. Margaret nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Charlotte ran ahead, her laughter ringing through the air. Walter noticed her approaching and stood, his face breaking into a warm smile. Eli looked up, his harmonica stopping mid-note as he grinned widely. "Charlotte," Eli exclaimed, "I was hoping we'd see you again." By the time David and Margaret caught up, Charlotte was already deep in conversation with Eli, the two of them laughing as they talked about harmonica tunes and rainy day adventures. Walter greeted Margaret and David with a polite nod, his expression calm as always. "Good to see you again," Walter said, extending a hand. David shook it firmly, meeting Walter's gaze with a newfound respect. "Likewise, I didn't expect to run into you here." Walter gestured to the park around them. "It's one of my favorite places, quiet, peaceful, a good spot to reflect." Margaret smiled. "We've always loved this park too. It's nice to see familiar faces here." David hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last week, about how quick I was to assume the worst. I owe you more than just an apology, Walter. You reminded me of something important, something I hadn't realized I'd forgotten." Walter tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "And what's that?" "That kindness doesn't need a reason," David said. "It doesn't need an explanation or an excuse. You didn't know Charlotte, but you helped her anyway. And that's something I need to work on." Walter's face softened, and he gave a small nod. "Kindness is simple, David. It's not always easy, but it's simple. We just have to choose it. Eli's voice interrupted them. "Hey, Mr. Benson," he called, holding up his harmonica. "Want me to teach Charlotte how to play?" David laughed, the sound genuine. "I think she'd like that, Eli." Charlotte's eyes lit up. "Really? Can I, Dad?" "Go for it," David said, smiling at her excitement. "Maybe you can even teach me a thing or two once you've learned." Margaret leaned closer to Walter, her tone lighthearted. "I think Eli's found himself a harmonica partner." Walter chuckled. "Eli's always been good at bringing people together. It's one of his gifts." As the children played, David and Walter continued their conversation, moving to sit on the bench overlooking the park. "You've been through a lot," David said, glancing at Walter's hands, which bore the marks of years of hard work. "I can tell." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Life hasn't always been kind, but I've learned that bitterness doesn't solve anything. You take what you're given and do the best you can." David hesitated before asking, "Do you ever feel like the world's stacked against you? Like, no matter what you do, people will always see you a certain way?" Walter leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "I used to feel that way," he admitted. "When I was younger, it frustrated me to no end. But over time, I realized that the only person who can define my worth is me. I stopped trying to prove myself to others and focused on living with integrity." David absorbed his words, nodding slowly. "That's not an easy thing to do." "No, it's not," Walter agreed. "But it's worth it." By late afternoon, the children had moved from harmonica lessons to a game of tag, their laughter echoing through the park. Margaret joined them, cheering them on as they raced around the open grass. Walter and David watched from the bench, their conversation flowing easily now. "You've got a good family," Walter said, his tone sincere. David smiled, his gaze softening as he watched Charlotte. "I'm lucky," he said, "but I haven't always been the best example for them. Last week reminded me of how much I still have to learn." Walter placed a hand on David's shoulder. "The fact that you're willing to learn says a lot. It's never too late to grow, David." For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of clarity. He realized that kindness wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the small, everyday choices that shaped how people connected with one another. As the sun began to set, the group gathered their things, preparing to leave the park. Charlotte hugged Walter tightly, her voice bright. "Thank you for everything," she said. "I'll never forget what you did for me." Walter crouched to her level, his smile warm. "And I'll never forget your bravery, Charlotte. You reminded me that even in scary moments, there's always hope." Eli held up his harmonica triumphantly. "Next time, we'll play a duet," he declared, earning a laugh from everyone. As the Benson family walked back to their car, David glanced over his shoulder one last time. Walter and Eli were still there, waving goodbye. David felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for what they had done for Charlotte, but for the lessons they had taught him about humility, kindness, and the power of connection. "I think today was a good day," Charlotte said, her voice sleepy as she climbed into the car. "It was," David agreed, his voice soft. "And it's the start of something even better." The weeks following the events at the police station passed quickly, but their impact lingered. The Benson family found themselves carrying the lessons of that day into their daily lives. For Charlotte, it was a newfound bravery and understanding of the good in people. For Margaret, it was the importance of showing gratitude and seeking connection. And for David, it was the slow but meaningful work of unlearning his biases and opening his heart to a broader understanding of kindness and humanity. One crisp autumn morning, the Benson family prepared to attend a community event held in the very neighborhood where they had first met Walter and Eli. Margaret packed a basket of homemade cookies, while Charlotte excitedly talked about seeing her new friends again. David adjusted his tie in the mirror, feeling a mix of anticipation and reflection. "You look nervous," Margaret teased, watching him from the doorway. David chuckled lightly, running a hand over his tie. "I guess I am. This is the first time I've really stepped into their world, instead of expecting them to step into mine." Margaret walked over, placing a hand on his arm. "That's exactly why this matters. You're showing Charlotte and yourself how much you've grown." David nodded, taking her words to heart. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. The event was held in a small but vibrant community center, its walls adorned with colorful murals painted by local artists. Tables lined with food, crafts, and music equipment filled the space. and the hum of lively conversation created a warm, welcoming atmosphere. As soon as they walked in, Charlotte spotted Eli near a makeshift stage. He was adjusting his harmonica, clearly preparing for a performance. Walter stood beside him, chatting with a group of neighbors. When Eli saw Charlotte, his face lit up. "Charlotte!" he called, waving her over. "You made it!" Charlotte ran to him, her excitement bubbling over. "Of course I did. Are you going to play something?" "Yup," Eli said proudly. "It's a special song I've been practicing just for today. You'll see." Walter noticed the Bensons approaching and greeted them with a warm smile. "Good to see you all again," he said, shaking David's hand firmly. David returned the handshake, his gratitude evident. "It's good to see you too, Walter. Thanks for inviting us." Margaret handed Walter the basket of cookies, her tone light. "We couldn't come empty-handed," Walter chuckled. "You didn't have to, but thank you. I'm sure Eli will make quick work of these." Eli overheard and grinned. "You bet I will." As the event unfolded, David found himself mingling with the locals, listening to their stories and learning about their experiences. It was humbling to hear about their struggles and triumphs, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose. For the first time, he saw the neighborhood not as a place of hardship, but as a community full of resilience, creativity, and potential. At one point, he found himself in a quiet conversation with Walter. The older man leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed, but his gaze thoughtful. "You've come a long way since the first time we met," Walter remarked, his tone kind but direct. David nodded, his voice reflective. "I had a lot to learn, and still do. Meeting you and Eli changed the way I see things. It's made me want to do better, not just for myself, but for my family." Walter smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of life, isn't it? We're always learning, always growing. The important thing is that you're trying." David hesitated, then said, "You've taught me more than I can say, Walter. I owe you a debt of gratitude." Walter shook his head. "No debts here, David. Just keep passing it forward. That's how the world gets better." As the day wound down, Eli took the stage, harmonica in hand. The crowd quieted as he began to play, his small figure radiating confidence. The melody was bright and hopeful, each note resonating with the joy and unity of the day. Charlotte watched with wide eyes, clapping along enthusiastically. When Eli finished, the room erupted into applause. Walter clapped the loudest, his pride evident. Charlotte ran up to Eli, hugging him tightly. "You were amazing," she exclaimed. Eli shrugged, grinning. "What can I say? It's my thing." David watched the scene with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He turned to Margaret, his voice soft. This feels right, like we're part of something bigger." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's because we are." As the Bensons prepared to leave, Charlotte hugged Walter tightly. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice full of sincerity. Walter knelt to her level, his smile warm. "Thank you, Charlotte. You remind me that even in the hardest times, there's always hope." David extended a hand to Walter once more. "I'll be in touch," he said. "I want to be part of the work you're doing here." Walter nodded, his expression steady. "We'll be glad to have you." The Bensons walked back to their car as the sun began to set, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Charlotte skipped ahead, humming the tune Eli had played. David and Margaret followed hand in hand, their hearts full. "Today was a good day," Margaret said softly. David nodded, his voice thoughtful. "It was, and it's just the beginning." As they drove away, the community center faded from view, but its spirit stayed with them. It was more than just a day of music and conversation. It was a turning point, a reminder of the power of kindness, connection, and the hope that comes from embracing change. As we come to the end of this deeply moving story, it's time to pause and reflect on the powerful lessons it carries. Walter and Eli's quiet but profound kindness reminds us of the importance of standing up for others, even when it means facing judgment or misunderstanding. Their actions weren't just about helping Charlotte, they were about embodying the kind of humanity we should all strive for, a humanity that chooses compassion over fear and courage over complacency. David's journey is equally inspiring. It's a testament to the idea that growth doesn't stop, no matter how old we are or how deeply rooted our perspectives may be. By challenging his own biases, David not only became a better father to Charlotte, but also opened his heart to the beauty of connection, trust, and understanding. His willingness to admit his mistakes and learn from them is a reminder to us all. Change is hard, but it's always possible. Now, let's turn the story over to you. Have you ever found yourself in a moment where your assumptions were challenged, where someone you doubted proved you wrong? What did you take away from that experience? Or maybe you've been in Walter's shoes, judged unfairly, but choosing to act with kindness anyway. How did you navigate that? And what would you want others to learn from your journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories, reflections, and ideas can help inspire someone else, just as this story may have inspired you. After all, conversations like these are how we grow as a community, learning from each other's experiences and finding the courage to be better together. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that small acts of kindness can have a ripple effect far beyond what we can see. Walter and Eli didn't just help Charlotte find her way home. They reminded an entire family of the power of empathy, compassion, and hope. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of change, not just in David, but in everyone who witnessed their story. Kindness isn't about grand gestures or recognition. It's about choosing to do good, no matter how small, because it's the right thing to do. It's about believing in the best of humanity, even when the world gives you reasons to doubt it. And most importantly, it's about remembering that we all have the power to be that person for someone else, the person who makes a difference. Stories like these remind us of what truly matters, and we're so grateful you've taken the time to experience this one with us. But this is just one of many stories waiting to be told, stories of resilience, kindness, and the unbreakable human spirit. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to join our growing community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Together, we can explore more tales of love, humanity, and hope, and continue building a space where kindness is celebrated. Before we go, let me leave you with one final thought. How will you choose to create a ripple of kindness in your life today? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, thank you for being here with us. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself and others, and remember, small acts of kindness can change the world.